Wolf introduces, those three areas: goals, procedures, and outcomes or effects. And, we found nice handful of studies that reported on one of those aspects of social validity related specifically to their FA. So it was interesting that, in these published studies, they're looking at least at one of those aspects, but why not assess the other two of the other three?
These specific different FA methods typically stem from a need in one of those areas to try to identify function in either a safer, quicker, more effective, more efficient way. And some of them maybe, and that was the thought, maybe some of these are more socially valid than others. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're more valid particularly than others, and that's a really key point that's made in the discussion. But are some of them more socially valid? If that were to be the case, that's another thing to consider when deciding which specific method to choose within your own clinical practice.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another episode of Cooperant Learning. We've got a fun one today. We are talking about social validity and functional analyses, two topics that I'm excited to dive into. I don't know. What about you, Dr. Steve? How are you feeling today?
I mean, how am I feeling or am I excited? Those are two completely different questions. Like, this is my life of doing functional assessments anyways. We don't do that many functional analyses anymore, but the allergy season is kicking hard in this family over here. So,
man, so is it allergies or are you getting hit with you're not getting hit with the heavy stuff like the RSV and stuff like that, are you?
I mean, it could be both. Who knows? I don't go to the doctor unless I really can't breathe at all. So we'll assume that it's allergies. And, yeah. No, the doctor's always like, yeah, it could be allergies. It could be whatever. Here, just do this. And so I just do that ahead of time now and we're good.
Yeah. No, I'm healthy and I'm hoping to stay healthy. Here's your segue. I'm hoping to stay healthy to the end of May because we got a fun event coming up.
Oh, yeah. Anybody that's going to be at an ABAI in San Francisco there, make sure you come find us, grab some swag. Got all kinds of stuff. Kyle was supposed to come up with all of our swag and do all this stuff on the back end and make sure it was stuff he liked, but he didn't do any of those things. And so I made radical behavior analyst shot glasses, Cooperant Learning playing cards, got some koozies with our radical behavior analyst rat here, and a few other things going around. So come steal some free stuff. We'll have some drawings. It'll be a good time, and make sure you give Kyle a hard time for not doing his job right. And
see, the few other things that you are kind of glazing over are the things that I did design and make for us, but you're refusing to
I'm
show.
not giving
That's
you
cool.
credit. Not giving you credit.
We aren't here to bicker, though. We're here to talk about some cool stuff. We have some cool guests today. Let's introduce them now. They are two of a group of co-authors in a concise review of social validity assessments during functional analyses of challenging behavior. That's in the November 2025 edition of JABA. We have an associate professor and director of research for the Center of Autism at Oakland University, whose research interests include relapse of problem behavior, supervision best practices, and protection of the profession of behavior analysis. Dr. Michael Kranak is joining us. Welcome, Michael.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Joining him, assistant professor in the Department of Applied Behavioral Science at the University of Kansas, board certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. His research and clinical work focus on the assessment, treatment, and prevention of challenging behavior, the evaluation of safe and valid functional assessment methods, and the study of preference and choice patterns among individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Dr. Isaac Melanson, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had some great guests out of University of Kansas. How are things going out there?
Things are going well. Things are going really good. Weather's nice. Not a whole lot to complain about. We've had some recent storms that we've come to the other side of, which is nice. But yeah, looking forward to the summer, and Kansas is going great.
Awesome. And Michael, you're from our neck of the woods. How's things in Oakland going?
Well, there's two seasons in Michigan. You either get the white of winter or the orange construction cone of spring and summer. So, we're transitioning out of the cold of the winter and into the orange of the construction zone season. But, all things considered, it's a rainy day right now. But yeah, like Isaac said, can't complain. I'm just glad to be out of the cold and not having to deal with like 20 degrees anymore.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, no, same here. Same here. Honestly, the kids still like my son the other day was wearing like a winter coat and like shorts, and he had like his bike helmet on, but then also like a pair of sandals. And I was like, you are just so confused about what to even expect today.
I've got a 16-month-old. And the one thing I will say is, he'll go out there and it can be sub-zero, and he's like, "What are you talking about? Like, let's get after it." I will say,
Yeah.
Having to fight the ticks right now, that's a big problem. So I'd rather deal with the snow than
Yeah.
the ticks in our woods, I think. But I digress.
I also want to point out that Kyle claimed you're from our neck of the woods, and he's down in Indiana. Like he can even claim to be our neck of woods here. Like you and I are probably 5 miles away from each other as we sit, and then there he is down there, claiming to be from the great state of Michigan. So
We're all
Compared-
Midwesterners,
Yeah.
Midwestern nice.
Comparatively
Come
to-
on.
Yeah, compared to Kansas, it's one neck of the woods.
I did spend some time in Michigan for a couple years in my master's program. I'm from Wisconsin originally, so I know the feeling of the cold, long winters.
Indiana gets all the same weather, just without the fun of the lakes on either side, and really any other fun. We just kind of hang out down here. But yeah, anyway, let's talk about your article. That's what we're here to do. I don't know how to transition well from that, but here we go.
no, the transition was fine. It was just almost deprecating. Anyways, let's get to what we're here for.
We have a lot
Enough
of good
about
food.
Indiana. Moving on to other fun things.
I want to talk about this article though. It was a good read. It was a short article. There's a lot packed in there though, and I think that there's a lot of discussion and implications from what you got from what y'all found. But let's kind of talk about maybe first just what motivated you to conduct this review, and describe maybe kind of what your research entailed. What was kind of the question you were looking for, and what were you seeking to answer?
I think that it generally stems, well, not I think, I know that it generally stems from my lab and my colleagues' work, broadly speaking, when it comes to improving the assessment and treatment process related to severe problem behavior. So it's definitely tied back to that. And, what really stemmed this project is a lot of discussions that my lab and I had seen on social media and just other dissemination platforms like podcasts and conference presentations, where we've seen a lot of, I call them spirited discussions related to, whether or not different types of functional assessments or functional analyses are or are not socially valid. Megan and Meredith are the co-authors on this paper. They had asked me, what does the data say? I was like, oh, look at you all being great behavior analysts and students of the game, actually wondering what do the data say on this topic. Did a little bit of digging, and lo and behold, not a ton of data out there. So we said, okay, well, let's chase this down and find it. And so that's what led us to collaborating with Dr. Melanson, where he and Dr. Tara Fahmy put out a great systematic review on FAs broadly speaking. We said, hey, you down to clown with this? And so we were able to replicate their procedures, and I'll let Isaac talk about that as well. And we just said, okay, let's chase this down and see what do the data actually say when it comes to the social validity of functional analyses. And, to spill the beans for any listeners that haven't checked out the article, no matter what type of FA you're running, it's probably socially valid. So it's just cool to, we really wanted to bring some data to these conversations rather than opinions and various perspectives. Gotcha.
Isaac, anything to piggyback on with that?
Not too much. I will say, I'm pretty sure that was the exact terminology Michael used in the email. Are you down to clown?
Down to clown.
I got this idea. Should we do it? Do you want to join? Heck yeah, let's do it. So yeah, it is Michael and Michael's labs. They're the ones that reached out. They're the ones that thought of it, but I was definitely happy to be included.
Let's review social validity and the definition of it. I like that 1978 Wolf paper. We want to talk about kind of what Wolf said in that paper about social validity, and kind of, if at all, that definition has evolved into modern times.
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit. So his three main components on what he might consider to be socially valid, and ones that we tried to hit on in the paper, were this idea of socially significant goals, the appropriateness of the procedures, as well as the importance of the effects. And so there's kind of these three aspects of social validity. One really neat thing I think about the paper was that not only did we look to see if authors were reporting on social validity measures for functional analyses, but we also looked a little bit further to see, okay, if they are they directly measuring those goals, procedures, effects, what might be talked about more, what might be talked about less, and can we kind of point some of these things out so that researchers as well as clinicians might start thinking about some of these things that are reported on less in the future.
I think that was something that was interesting is, as Isaac just talked about, Wolf introduces, those three areas: goals, procedures, and outcomes or effects. And, we found nice handful of studies that reported on one of those aspects of social validity related specifically to their FA. So it was interesting that, in these published studies, they're looking at least at one of those aspects, but why not assess the other two or the other three? So I just think it was just an interesting point. And whether or not that definition has changed, I'm not so sure. But I think what has changed is the way in which people are talking about social validity. And so one thing that we felt strongly about is making the point, like, let's talk about the goals, procedures, and outcomes or effects of an FA. One of the things that we noticed is, an increase of terminology being used to talk around this concept of social validity. So things like acceptability, televisibility, helpfulness, and those are all important things to consider, but it's also critical to make sure that we're using the same terms regardless of the assessment or analysis we're using, because that will enable fair comparisons, or speaking loosely, the ability to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
Gotcha. Yeah, I really like that because, an outcome might be one that's highly desired, but the means of getting there might be something. And if that's, that might be something else. And if that's not captured, then we're kind of missing the complete picture. Steve, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering, with the way you defined social validity for your research, is it more about the present stakeholders, guardians, family members, individuals around, or were you able to take any kind of broader social validity from society as a whole? Because I can definitely see where if someone's coming to you for this, there is an issue, and sure, they're gonna find more socially valid. But I know with our field in general, we kind of have this optics issue, because if you're just outside looking in, you don't know what's going on. You're like, why are you putting the child through this type of situation? I can see society as a whole saying, not feeling as valid about it until they knew the more details of it anyways.
I think that that's a fair critique to say of any scientific field or professional field, though. Like, so for example, if you were to see a child struggling on an academic exam, for example, or struggling on an assessment in school, that might not look great to the child's parent watching that happen, but to the teacher, they might recognize that they're going to get some really helpful and valid information out of that assessment that will allow them to tailor their instructional strategies to help them be the best student that they can be. Another analogy that I would like to use is, I imagine several listeners out there have had a loved one undergo major surgery, right? Probably none of us want to watch our loved ones undergo major surgery, but just because we don't want to watch open heart surgery happen or, a knee replacement happen, that doesn't mean it's not socially valid, because it's going to have great, outcomes for the individual. They'll be able to walk better. The procedure is probably minorly invasive compared to when they first started doing knee replacements. And I'd like to hope that if a surgeon is conducting surgery, they probably have some proficiency at implementing that procedure. And so I would imagine that would be socially valid as far as work that we would consider that.
I definitely think as long as people are educated, they'd have trouble. Every time I've had to do one, and I always get that look from a guardian for like, you're going to do what now? You're going to try to occasion at least precursor or some level of target behavior, and then tell them it's like the allergy test. You have to see where the reaction is, and that almost always wins over. Okay, no, that makes sense.
Yep.
You can go for it. But I can definitely see outside observers not knowing that and having a different reaction to what they're seeing.
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%. And there's a great paper by Vollmer and Pendergast that came out in Perspectives on Behavior Science, I think in 2024 or 2025. I think it came out in 2024 and hit the issue in 2025. But too long, don't read. All behavior analysts can and should do a better job conducting and assessing social validity, or conducting social validity assessments and collecting those data, regardless of what the assessment or the treatment process is, regardless of whatever area we're working in. We could do a better job amassing these social validity data that can help answer some of these questions and sort of assuage concerns that, oh no, this looks bad, but no, it's not. It's really okay.
Yeah, I feel like it's every few episodes that something like this comes up, some discussion, and I'm saying, as a science, there is no such thing as good or bad. It's either effective or not effective. But
Right.
society as a whole needs to determine what is socially valid or not, what we should be using and should not be using. And we may have our own personal opinions on that as well, but it doesn't really matter if society doesn't want our help anymore because they don't agree with what we're doing on a broad scale.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue into the paper. So, talk a little bit about the methods used in the paper, what your review entailed, and what you were looking for in your lit review.
Yeah, I can speak to this. As Michael had mentioned, his lab had kind of had this idea. Fortunately, my former advisor, Dr. Tara Fahmy, when I was in Omaha at the Monroe Meyer Institute, he published a large review of functional analysis research and results and outcomes in the past 10 years at that time. So that was 2013 through 2023, or the first part of 2023 at least. Actually, first part of 2022. It was published in 2023. And for the concise review model for Java, they're looking for a small period of time, particularly data from recent years. And so when Michael reached out, it seemed like a really good situation, considering how often these topics have been discussed recently, to kind of try to follow that format and look at the past 5 years and see if folks, researchers, and clinicians are reporting on social validity assessments and measures within functional analysis, within their functional analyses. And so the good news is we already had 2 years of data in the past 5 years. So that was helpful. And we already had a tried and true method to determine and identify as many functional analysis articles we possibly could from the literature. And that was based on previous work from Brian Iwata and Greg Hanley too, from 2003, and then a follow-up FA review in 2013. We did add a few additional terms to look into, but essentially we were able to identify as many FA studies through to the end of the year in 2024 to be able to then code those specific articles a little bit more closely, specifically related to whether or not those specific authors were reporting on social validity measures. And then again, kind of diving a little bit further into the goals, procedures, outcomes, as well as the different types of functional analyses that they were implementing, because that was a really big part of why we were looking into this as well, is to identify, hey, maybe there are certain researchers who are doing different types of FA methodology that are actually reporting socially valid outcomes more often. Is that something that should be reported? And so that was another kind of key aspect of how we designed the specific coding variables.
Gotcha. So the review that you did after finding as many articles in the last 4 or 5 years that included FAs, and how many of those actually included social validity measures on the FA themselves?
Yeah, so I'm looking here. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. It looks like 20. So that was out of the 176 articles that were included. And that was after we had, there's a certain number of articles that come through that might be relevant, and you kind of limit that down based on if they actually did a functional analysis or reported those data. And that singled it down to 176, and then only 11% of those 176 actually included some sort of measure for social validity for the functional analysis explicitly. So that was just 20 out of the 176. So
Was that surprising to you guys, or?
I wouldn't say surprising. There's been a couple of reviews now that have looked at just social validity data in general. There was a recent publication in JABA from Leaf and colleagues, and I think they reported similar, if not slightly higher numbers, but they were looking more so at intervention as well, which treatment that's been the main call, I think, for social validity measures, not so much so on functional analysis. Obviously, there has been some discussion on that, but they reported relatively low numbers in general anyway. And so I'm not super surprised at the low number, or at least the low reported number. I don't know if you were at all, Michael.
I wouldn't say surprised. I think, perhaps pleasantly surprised because like you just said, a lot of the, push to collect social validity data is on treatment outcomes. And we were specifically looking at whether or not someone assessed social validity of a functional analysis. And so I think the fact that there were 20 studies in which an FA was conducted out of those 176 that actually looked specifically at the social validity of an FA, I find that in part encouraging, that those data even exist to begin with. So I would say pleasantly surprised, but also hopeful for the future that I think we're going to see this become more of a
Yeah,
more
that's an
precedented
excellent
and more common.
That's an excellent point, Michael. It is interesting, even though it is, on the ground a really low percentage. Obviously, if you were just to tell somebody who wasn't familiar with this specific area that only 11% reported on social validity measures for functional analyses, I'd be like, that's very low. Maybe I am slightly pleasantly surprised that it was actually that high. I mean, if that sounds, I don't know how that sounds, but it's not something that's often reported, and full disclosure, not something that I've reported in any studies that I've published on functional analyses. So it's perhaps surprising that it was even that high.
I think it kind of makes sense though as well, like from a global perspective, when we're working out in the field with people doing functional assessments, that sort of thing, we are getting permission, getting signatures to implement the behavior plan, making sure everybody understands it. There's no checking in before the assessment, and again, we're usually doing FBAs stopping before we actually get to a functional analysis technique, but even then I think society just assumes, hey, you have this assessment. As long as it's based on science, then why should we say your assessment needs approval or needs that
Right.
social validation? But when I first started coming out of school, I think doing FAs worried me more about the optics than the behavior plans, because I could easily explain why I'm doing what I'm doing there. But letting this child or adult, for who we tend to work with, potentially engage in physical violence against myself as I'm assessing, that looks much worse compared to here's a questionnaire that a lot of other fields might use.
Right.
Which does happen sometimes. And so the results of social acceptability were generally positive from what I've read. Although like we said, a little bit small on the numbers end. How should we interpret those positive results? And this is in terms of people who did take the social validity assessments tended to say it was socially acceptable to. They were pleased with the outcomes and procedures of the FA. Correct me if I got any of that incorrect, but yeah.
That all sounds correct to me, and I think we should be encouraged by that. That regardless of the type of FA that was implemented in this study, and regardless of the type of FA for which we have data across the board, it was very socially valid in terms of goals, procedures, and outcomes when assessed. And so we need to take, if we're going to be science-based practitioners in a science-based field, well, if the data say that FAs are socially valid, then the available evidence that we have suggests that they're valid. And so, we need to, not rest on our laurels. Again, we can and should do a better job of taking more social validity data in some capacity. And we can also recognize and have the confidence to move forward knowing that the data is on our side, regardless of the type of FA that we're implementing.
With that, I had a question. When you mentioned that it was kind of positive across the board, do you think there are scenarios or situations where people may find it to be less socially valid? So maybe more intense behavior, or a situation where the behavior is not very intense, and so you kind of don't think we need to go this far into this methodology, that sort of thing?
I think it would. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just necessarily about, the social validity of a functional analysis specifically, but a functional assessment more broadly. At what point of the process would we conclude that we have the information we need that can give us the confidence to say we have a good understanding of why the behavior is or is not occurring, and we know we have the information that we need to develop an efficacious and ultimately effective treatment as well. And so I think that recognizing too that the social validity is just one aspect that we need to consider when deciding what type of functional assessment or analysis to use. I think that we do a disservice when we say like one factor is the end all be all. That's why we're behavior analysts and not behavior modifiers. We consider a whole constellation of factors for underlying the assessment and treatment decisions that we make. And social validity, although important, is only one factor.
No, I agree with Michael. I think, it's also important to consider that you mentioned high severity behavior, I think, or very challenging behavior. In those situations, oftentimes there's been a lot of attempts to try to reduce it with multiple different methods and perhaps haven't been successful if they are being prescribed a functional analysis of their challenging behavior. And so in this situation, if it's going to lead to an outcome that's going to inform a function based intervention that's likely to be effective or has a potential to be effective, I think in those situations, the goals, which oddly enough, were not reported within the assessment a whole lot. But I think the goals themselves, you're probably going to, I would assume, see pretty high results or acceptability because it is going to ideally lead to an effective or potentially effective treatment. These challenging behaviors, the reason why it's being referred in the first place to functional analysis is because they're occurring already. They're occurring on a day-to-day basis. They might be, very dangerous for themselves or for others in their environment. And so yes, these specific behaviors may occur within the assessment, but it is a step ideally to getting to the next part, which is identifying that function-based treatment. And so I think a lot of people, it doesn't surprise me in the sense that the results were widely acceptable in that regard.
Were they kind of generally positive overall, or were there some that did not find them acceptable, or was it kind of just 100% across the board? Everybody found it acceptable, maybe because you wouldn't actually perform the procedure if the caregivers didn't find it acceptable.
There were some where they didn't find them, where there were lower social validity marks. So if I'm recalling one of the studies, off the top of my head correctly, I think it was they assessed social validity with a teacher, and the procedures got low social validity marks because those procedures could have been disruptive in the classroom. Which, again, only one thing that we factor when deciding, when to assess what type of FA to use. So, okay, in that example, if we're working with that teacher, maybe we don't run a trial-based FA in the classroom. Can we find a resource room where we can run, another type of functional analysis, for example? So, no, not across the board, 100% gold stars. Everybody passes, but generally speaking, very high marks across the board.
And then I think, to Michael's point there. So then if the score is lower, it's less acceptable, then how can we modify? Are there ways that we can work with the teachers in this case, or the caregivers or the client or what have you, to increase that acceptability score so they feel more comfortable with those specific procedures?
100%.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about in our work, out of 350, 400 clients we have at any given time, we have a handful that don't like any of our procedures, don't want any of our suggestions. And it's a level of distrust because of the system and how they've been treated as a whole. So I don't blame the people there, especially because we don't tend to get referrals until they've been on years of medication and gone through all these different therapies that are not effective. But I mean, if we're fighting with someone over functional communication training or something like that, then it's very unlikely for them to ever find the FA procedures acceptable. So I didn't know if those people would then be kind of removed from the study because it's an outlier, or if that might affect the overall finding of the acceptability as well.
So that's a good question. I mean, that's, again, we're coding these specific results based on the literature, and oftentimes it's not just, if ever, just a study on socially valid measures within the FA. There's always, follow-up functional analysis and then treatment. It's just that these authors happened to also report on those things, and so the decisions potentially to modify or so on is probably up to those specific authors in this instance. And again, a reason for additional research in this area, because it would be nice. The only way to identify if there's specific areas within functional analyses that might not be as socially acceptable is to continue to measure these things and report on them, so that as a science we are able to evolve and extend based on that.
Steve, you make a good point too, and it's like whoever is completing these social validity assessments and being asked about the social validity of the assessments and treatments, they're bringing their own history to filling out those assessments. Like you said, if you've got a caregiver who has, a child or a loved one who's been engaging in such high levels of problem behavior to the point where it's necessitating, your team coming in and conducting these more intensive assessments, and you're fighting over a red card, green card, multiple schedule and FCT, you're like, of course, they might be a little suspect that you want to cause more problem behavior to maybe refine your assessment and treatment. So I think that's a good reminder for all of us that everybody's bringing their own learning history to these social validity assessments. And so we need to just be mindful of that when we're asking them these questions.
Yeah, I won't put you on the spot. The one that really came to mind historically, though, was the one that was fighting because they really wanted us to do facilitated communication instead of FCT. Like, don't teach a new language. Let's just do some facilitated communication. That's good enough. And so we won't ask you about the social validity aspect in that situation.
Yes, no tangents about pseudoscience today.
I mean, we could. I do want to move on just a little bit, though. I really like how you guys broke it down further then and took the data on, how often the goals, the assessment procedures, and the outcomes were assessed in the social validity assessment. And I have the numbers here, so you don't have to look it up. But 10% of the research included an assessment of goals in the social validity. 95% of the procedures and 30% of the assessment outcomes. Were those numbers surprising to you, or how do you interpret those?
I would say it was surprising to me that they would ask about one aspect and not all three. And so it begs the question, what was the rationale for doing so? And again, good opportunity for future research to sort of standardize the way in which we talk and ask about social validity. But I'm also going to be a hypocrite because I just said, we need to be more systematic and principled about how we ask about this. Well, what's an easy way to assess, those three outcomes about an FA? Just simply ask, the caregiver, for example, like, hey, what'd you think about this? Do we need to have like this, elongated, 55-point, 18-point Likert scale to ask these questions? I don't think that's the answer. Although, again, I'm going to say it would be good to systematize it across assessments. And one way to do that is just be quick and efficient and just ask them like, hey, what do you think about this? So I would say I was surprised that, the data weren't more similar across all of the three components of social validity. Isaac, would you agree with that?
I would agree. I think to hit on your point about, simply asking caregivers, I think that is happening. I would imagine that is happening more often than is being reported. I would feel pretty confident in saying that. We're working with what's reported here, and this is a call potentially to researchers to find ways that are valid, and report on those. But also, like within clinical practice, there's going to be opportunities where you might need to conduct a functional analysis. I would imagine that most clinicians, I would hope that most clinicians, and I would feel pretty confident in suggesting that most clinicians are having those conversations with caregivers and talking about those specific procedures and the goals of those procedures before doing it. So even though the numbers seem a little bit low, particularly for goals, I do think that those conversations are being had. It's just not maybe reported within the functional analysis literature.
Gotcha.
I want to go back 10 years and redo my dissertation and just see the questionnaire, 3 questions versus 50. What is the social validity? Like by the time I get to question 50, I hate everything you want to do. Just get me out of here. I don't want any of it. It dropped 10% because of it.
Yep.
It's getting lower as we keep talking.
Well, it's kind of similar to how I imagine we assess preferences. I mean, we all, run, our prepared choice, our free operant, our MSWOs. We probably run those, formally in practice. But I also imagine that what happens routinely is if you have an array of potential reinforcers, perhaps before the next session, you ask your client, hey, what do you want to work for right now? And they select a high preferred stimulus 2 or 3 instead of their most preferred stimulus. We're probably not reporting that we're doing a quick and easy preference assessment in the moment, but that's probably happening. And so taking a similar approach to assessing social validity of FAs, I think would be a reasonable next step.
You had some data on the different types of functional analyses in your sample, but there was not data on the social validity of each type, was there?
So I've got it pulled up. So of the studies, there were 6 that had, standard FAs, 5 trial-based, 4 brief and 4 pairwise, 3 combo, 3 ISCAs, 1 extended, and 1 that was not specified. So we have some data for essentially every type of FA. We just don't have enough data for each type to make meaningful comparisons to say, this is the most socially valid, abandon all other FAs, ye who conduct
and not that it would
analyses.
necessarily lead us to think that either, but it was I've just never seen it broken up like that. It was interesting to look at.
I mean, some of those methods, if not all, have been designed as a modification to the standard functional analysis for similar reasons, either to emphasize on time or maybe safety, or I'm not specifically social validity, I would imagine, but things that are involved with social validity or socially valid procedures. And so these specific different FA methods typically stem from a need in one of those areas to try to identify function in either a safer, quicker, more effective, more efficient way. And some of them maybe, and that was the thought, maybe some of these are more socially valid than others. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're more
Right.
valid particularly than others. And that's a really key point that's made in the discussion. But are some of them more socially valid? If that were to be the case, that's another thing to consider when deciding which specific method to choose within your own clinical practice. And like Michael said, unfortunately, at this time, based on the data that we were able to find, it's too early on in the process to make any large claims about what might be or what might not be more socially valid.
It would be interesting to see how each one kind of pairs up with, and I'm just brain farting right now, but like group home staff versus teachers versus
Right.
parents of a young child, and how those all kind of
L-
square up with each other.
Let's try to brainstorm
100%.
instead of brain fart. That would be preferable.
It's a clinical term, right?
Yeah. Just something I thought of as you were talking about that as well. Was it clear if the social validity was on the procedures or after the fact, after it's been observed, what the caregiver, the stakeholders thought?
That's an awesome question. That was one thing that we were particularly interested in that we coded is when did they assess the social validity of the FA specifically? Because like you said, if they're assessing it after they've done the treatments, well, then they're probably, let's say they've reduced problem behavior to a meaningful and acceptable standard, they're probably going to be likely to rate the assessment high as well. And so that makes it difficult to disentangle the social validity of the treatment from the social validity of the assessment. And encouragingly, I believe it was 45%, if I'm recalling correctly. I think it was 45% of all studies that reported on the social validity of FAs reported on the social validity of FAs after the FA, but prior to moving to the treatment. And so they did a nice job of isolating the FA social validity from the treatment social validity. And so I think that's a key piece to remember to do as well.
It often feels awkward if you have a guardian that wants to be present, because I at least in many in our situations, we have to at least allow that if they ask to be. And
right.
The procedures ahead of time, like, this makes sense, I'm all for it. And then they start seeing what we're doing, and there's a decrease in that comfortability as it goes on. And so I wonder if there was some of the opposite effect too. We're like, all right, we took the social validity, but it was just as we went over what we're going to do, not actually after the assessment. And then it actually dropped some after they saw it as well.
Yeah, I don't think they weren't in the studies that we reviewed. They weren't that detailed whether or not they did it before they did as they were explaining it versus after. It was just whether or not they did before, after the FA and proceeding into treatment. But no, that's a great point as well. It's like you're going up you're going up a roller coaster. It's like you're probably very excited at the bottom. You get to the top, you're like, I would like to get off now, please. So very similar phenomenon might happen with caregivers in this situation.
You noted some inconsistent terminology across studies, and maybe this wasn't a big deal. I was just curious your thoughts on, coining it as like a questionnaire, interview, a scale, things like that. Does this impact our social validity findings in any way, do you think, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think in general, so they use within the article, they use the same terms just interchangeably. So one article might have used the term questionnaire and rating scale interchangeably. And so I think that that's a little bit more problematic, where it's just difficult to sort of follow what they're doing within the same study. But as long as we know a Likert scale is a Likert scale, then that's helpful for us to know. But I do think that we should be more precise in saying, if you're using a rating scale, don't call that a questionnaire, even though it is in some sense a questionnaire. If it's something that you created in-house, that's probably more accurate to label as a questionnaire rather than just a rating scale or something to that effect. So I think the issues that we ran into is where they were using those terms interchangeably within the same study rather than across studies.
I say, do you think there's any concern that when you're just checking in the moment, someone may not be 100% truthful? There's like, oh, no, but it's fine. Whether like if you did a questionnaire or a survey afterwards, they may feel more comfortable saying like, I didn't like this aspect, that sort of thing.
That's a good point. I perhaps don't ask them when they're in the middle of the throes of a bout of problem behavior in the middle of the FA. Perhaps debrief after, because also when you're doing that, they're probably busy taking data, making sure that they're safe, making sure that the client's safe. So I think keeping in mind when you're asking them is also something that's pertinent to think about. And I'd piggyback off of what Isaac said, where having some data is better than having no data, right? So even just a quick check-in like that, like, hey, how are things going? Not only is that important data, but it's a very natural thing. Rather than a caregiver dropping your client off at the beginning of a session, I will trade Uno reverse card. I'll trade you your kid for a rating scale real quick, or for a 50-point survey. We're not saying to do that. I think where Isaac and I would sort of push the envelope here is when we are conducting, research to specifically evaluate the social validity, acceptability, your adjective here, of an FA. We just need to make sure that we are being consistent in how we're assessing it, because the words and terms that we use are very likely to influence the responses that an individual is going to give us. So for example, if you ask a caregiver, what did you think of these procedures? That might yield a very different answer than, did you think these procedures were helpful, or did you think these procedures were acceptable? That's very different than asking, what did you think about the procedures, point blank. And so that's where I think that we would, why I want to stress the point about being standard as far as being able to make those comparisons across types of FAs.
I think it's clear that this is all about being ethical behavior analysts and making sure what we're doing, is acceptable to those around us.
Good. I mean, part of being an ethical behavior analyst and clinician is using socially valid, socially meaningful procedures. And so making sure that we're able to define what that means and not just saying those terms willy-nilly. That's pretty important. And so, a term that I like to use is, never weaponize the ethics code. So it's like never weaponize social validity against our colleagues and our peers. So there's your ethic.
Is there any discussion in any of these about the use of our jargon as a whole and the ethical implications? I know when I do a behavior plan and say I have a person who is urinating on the floor and the results suggest it is either attention or escape maintained, and so now what we would call overcorrection, we're just going to clean up the whole bathroom floor every time, even though it might only be in this corner. If you use the word overcorrection, everybody's like, oh my God, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. I'll never allow it. If you're just like, we're just gonna have them clean the area up afterwards, they're like, oh yeah, that makes tons of sense. Why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah.
It's all about having good audience control. I think that that's something that might be lost, especially on some newer folks that I'm seeing and in my experience. And so that's something that I stress to my students and mentees, is altering your vernacular based on that. And I'm all about ensuring, that we have good communication across stakeholders, across each other. But, one thing that is interesting to me is I feel like we're the only field, and perhaps I might be incorrect on this, but I feel like we're perhaps the only field where we're the only professional field who aren't allowed to have our own vernacular, right? So if you were to go to an orthopedic surgeon or to a phlebotomist or to any medical professional, and they throw around their terms, that might be a little off-putting to us because we don't know what they mean or what it means. So for example, if you go to a cardiologist and they start explaining a high sensitivity cardiac reactive protein, or HSCRP, most listeners probably have no idea what that means unless you're like me and really into, cholesterol and, hormones and diet changes and things like that. But that might be very off-putting. However, cardiologists and other related professionals in that arena are allowed to use those terms. So it's interesting to me that we seem to be self-flagellating in that capacity. Again, that's not to say that we shouldn't have good audience control, because any good forward-facing human services profession should have good audience control and should tailor their language in a way that's understood by whoever they're talking to.
Yeah. Tom Radkos, Jessica Van Straten, and I did a questionnaire for community mental health professionals outside of behavior analysis around the state of Michigan. Our number was too low to be able to get it published. We just didn't have enough responses. But in general, that we have a social validity issue just because of what our language is. I think, like, if you use the word negative punishment or positive punishment, just having the word positive there was going to be like make it more acceptable than having the word negative. But
Right.
if we say positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, really there was some misunderstanding whether or not positive punishment was better or worse than negative reinforcement. You know what I mean? Because there's just such a
Right.
misunderstanding of that. But if we just describe what we're doing, it's so much, more clear. I wonder if there are ever sometimes a terminology in, description of what we're doing in functional analyses, whether or not that might affect that as well. Has there been any discussion, any of the research on that at all, or not really?
Not to my knowledge, not specifically on FAs. I think that there's some good work has come out of Tom Critchfield and Matt Norman out of their labs and their groups that have looked at how terminology is rated and infected by, or what stakeholders think about it, and it's very similar to what you just described. And I think this is my biased knowledge of Michigan. I think the Michigan Mental Health Code makes it very difficult to do a lot of good ethical behavior analytic practices because of the terminology. For example, if you see either response restriction or simply something like withholding of a tangible item or contingent access, that raises, every red flag in the book. And Steve, I don't want to send you off on a tangent about
just
that.
one more. My favorite one was discrimination training. And we're teaching people to be like, to discriminate, or like, no, that, all right, never mind. We'll just not write that down anymore.
Right. Or like this notion that 3-year-olds have property. Like if a 3-year-old comes into the clinic, that tablet is their tablet. It's like, my brothers and sisters in Christ, no, it's not. It's the parent's tablet. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If a 3-year-old has, the monetary funds available to buy an iPad, I would like to know what side hustle they're doing so that I too may pursue that.
I will say I bought my first Nintendo at 2 years old because my cousins had one, but I got the same Christmas money they did. So there you go.
Oh man, there's a VHS tape somewhere of me getting my first NES somewhere at 6 years old. So, but it was a Christmas gift, so I was very excited, very excited. Hey, as we're kind of winding down on time, future research, further questions that y'all have on this topic, where do you see the research and what answers would you like uncovered going forward?
I mean, the obvious one, I think, is more include these assessments in practice, include these assessments in your research studies. It's important. I mean, these data are very small preliminary data, and it's important that we get more understanding or a better understanding on exactly what specific types of functional analyses might be more or less socially valid, if that exists. But there's some, I mean, yes, we had a small amount of studies that included socially valid measures for FAs, but there still were 20. And so there's some examples in the literature that you can, directly use to inform your own specific practices. Ideally, you're finding ones that are going to be more valid than others. But at the same time, I think a big key point of today was in clinical practice. It's important that we're checking in. It's important that we're measuring these types of things. And, if it is if you are doing a potential research project and you're going to conduct a functional analysis, then this might be a step that you might consider doing, but also reporting on and doing it well so that we can add to this body of literature and get a better understanding and move our science forward.
I echo that 110%. For the listeners, of air quotes, we know that we're all doing great work, right? We know that what we're doing is generally speaking accepted, and it leads to good outcomes that improves individuals' qualities of life, not just our clients, but also their families and their broader community. And so just taking a few minutes or a few moments even to just get these data and add it to the body of literature, I think that's going to be a tremendous and huge next step. And there's a big push right now to get more practitioners and clinicians involved in research. And one of the things that I stress again to my students and mentees is that the behaviors that researchers, again air quotes on that, and practitioners that they engage in, they're largely one and the same, right? So if you're evaluating data, it doesn't matter if you're in a more research specific context or a practitioner focused context, you're still engaging in data-based decision making. So my point here is that there's a bigger push to get practitioners involved in the research process. And so as practitioners and clinicians are listening to this, please start simply asking about the goals, procedures, and outcomes of your assessments and treatments, and you'll be able to, I think, make some meaningful contributions to the research literature. And so you too can publish on this, and you too can make a great contribution to our field beyond what you're already doing, of course.
Awesome. A call to action, if you will, for the clinicians listening. Very cool. Steve, anything I missed, or anything that I missed that y'all were like, man, we really should have talked about this before we kind of close up today?
I've done all the derailing I could consider or think of at the moment, other than still making fun of you for the brain fart a little bit more. I wish I had really hammered that home, but
Any questions from anybody in the audience for our guests? Cool. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Thank you both for being here. Michael and Isaac, the two of the authors on a concise review of social validity assessments during functional analyses of challenging behavior. Thanks so much for being here. Hope to have you all back soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I appreciate it.